Good morning, everyone. This morning we gather in celebration of Founders Day, one of the annual great state occasions of our school. Not many schools can celebrate a Founders Day, and no other school can remember a founding more historical, nor a founder more consequential in his time than ours. Roxbury Latin came to be thanks to the courage, vision, and talent of John Eliot. This year we celebrate the 376th anniversary of this momentous founding. Eliot was born more than 400 years ago in the tiny village of Whitford, England. His promise was evident early as he matriculated at Jesus College, Cambridge University at 14 and a half, well shy of the usual age at which boys went to university. Soon after Eliot's graduation, he was ordained and began to teach at Thomas Hooker's grammar school at Little Badow. It would not be long before he joined with like-minded pilgrims who sought to establish a settlement in the new world of New England. On November 2nd, 1631, Eliot and his compatriots arrived on the good ship Lion in Boston Harbor. While most luminaries must wait until history judges before they are accorded respect or adulation, such was not the case for Eliot. Even in his own time, he was revered for his character and his works. Because of his prowess as a preacher, Eliot was appointed teacher of the First Church in Roxbury and attracted as congregants the likes of the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Thomas Dudley, who was moved to join the congregation in order, as he put it, quote, to sit under Eliot's preaching, end quote. It was Governor Dudley, an appointee of the British monarchy, who joined with King Charles I in signing the Agreement of 1645, establishing the Roxbury Latin School. Eliot was a renowned author of more than 100 books and pamphlets. His greatest achievement as a writer was the translation of the Bible into the Algonquian language, a Herculean accomplishment. Because of his evangelical work among the Indians, work that was opposed by most whites at the time, Eliot was known widely as the apostle to the Indians. Several years ago, we were treated to a hall featuring Jessie Little Doe Baird, who was resurrecting that Algonquin language for her Wampanoag tribe. John Eliot is buried in Boston at the John Eliot Burial Ground in Nubian Square, Roxbury. In normal times, our Class 6 boys would have spent the equivalent of last Monday cleaning, clearing, and raking the ancient burial grounds. It is one of the many ways each year we pay tribute to and give thanks for our founder. Testimony to the widespread approval Eliot knew in his time is the marble plaque in the First Church of Roxbury that describes John Eliot as follows, quote, in zeal, he was equal to St. Paul. In charity, he was equal to St. Francis. He traversed the land for 40 years in perils of the wilderness, in perils of the heathen, in faithfulness to bear the gospel to the children of the woods, who were to him the children of God. He died May 21st, 1690, at the age of 86, first among Puritan saints, end quote. Each Founders Day, in addition to recognizing our school's founding and John Eliot's pivotal role in it, we choose to pay attention to some other important factor in our lives. Often we focus on a special anniversary or a notable feature of Greater Boston and its history. Last year, of course, for example, we traveled to the Back Bay and toured that storied neighborhood and spent time in beautiful Trinity Church, learning of its consequential impact on Boston over the years and connections to our own graduates and our history. Every 4 years, in presidential election years, we turn our attention not just to the election before us, but to the process of electing the president, the American political system, and more broadly, our role as citizens in honoring the expectation and promise of a representative democracy. Those of you who were in the school in Class 5 benefited from civics, a course consolidated and taught during May, and intended to introduce you to all the rights and responsibilities of American citizenship. We learned there that one's responsibilities and one's opportunities are broad and numerous. We talked about our court system, about jury duty. We talked about the process of immigration and heard from a panel of our community members on their respective odysseys. We talked about military service and heard from alumni who served, as we will again on this coming Veterans Day. Finally, we talked about our country's political process and underscored the various ways one can involve himself or herself in the effort to find and elect candidates. I reminded you that you could get involved by contributing your time, talent, and treasure on behalf of a candidate, helping to run a campaign, advocating for a candidate through door-to-door canvassing or making phone calls or writing letters to the editor. Most dramatically, I suggested that some of you should take the calculated risk and run for office yourselves, for school committees or town councils, or for state or national office. What I suggested should always be true as we consider our duty as American citizens is the responsibility to be informed and then to cast an informed ballot. In that regard, we reminded people that there are countless news sources, thanks to a burgeoning media and technology, and it fell to us as bright, caring citizens to learn to discern what is true and what is not, and how issues we care about indeed inform our own preferences when it comes to candidates. We acknowledge that in order to run for president, one must plan for all of his or her life to do so, to marshal resources and support, and to participate in the long, demanding ritual of campaigning and convincing voters of one's worthiness. We have witnessed over the past year the culmination of those candidacies. We have been appreciative of the special responsibility and complications of governing at this challenging time in our world's history. And we have formed an opinion about who would make the best president to serve as of inauguration day on January 20th for the next 4 years. Because there is so much to know about the process, and because I believe that honoring our responsibility as informed citizens is an ongoing, complicated task, our sessions today will focus on key elements that constitute the process: the Electoral College, the history of voting, the right to vote in the 19th Amendment, polling, running a campaign, voting in a straw poll ourselves. All will serve to inform and, I hope, inspire. Whether as a voter or a candidate, this civic responsibility is a logical extension of our school's admonition to lead and serve. I hope we will all be smarter and more passionate as a result. Our featured speaker today is Professor Alex Keyssar. Alex Keyssar is the Matthew Sterling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. A historian by training, he specializes in the exploration of historical problems that have contemporary policy implications. His book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, was named the best book in US history by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. In 2004-2005, Dr. Keyssar chaired the Social Science Research Council's National Research Commission on Voting and Elections, and he writes frequently for the popular press about American politics and history. Dr. Keyssar's latest book, titled Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, was published this year by Harvard University Press. There is perhaps no one better to help us kick off this Founders Day, focused on the realities and outcomes of the American electorate, than Professor Alex Keyssar.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you for the kind introduction, and more broadly, thank you for inviting me to be present, to the extent that I'm actually present on this day and in this tradition after this, the Founders Day, and the remarkable founder of this school and this remarkable school. So I'm pleased and honored to be here. And let me see what it is that I can offer to the students here. You know, the starting point, quite simply, is that I've spent a lot of time over the last 30 years thinking about different features of American democracy. And what I really want to do basically is to share some of the conclusions I've reached, some of the thoughts that I've had, some perhaps insights. I think they're insights that might be of interest to you. And there are two themes in general that I want to address, and they both bear very directly on this election. One is the history of the right to vote, the evolution of voting rights, and the other is the Electoral College itself. The history of the right to vote in the U.S. is actually very curious and non-linear. I mean, we all assembled in this room, whatever room we are assembled in. You know, I think inescapably tend to take things about the right to vote for granted. And we have, or we've absorbed in our lives, the broad outlines of a kind of general history. It's a general history that the history of the right to vote is a story of progress. It's a story of improvement and enlargement. You've probably heard aspects of this, that in the beginning of the Republic, when the Constitution is written, when the nation is founded, only adult white men with property or taxpayers could vote, except in Vermont, which was always way ahead of its time. But that was the basic rule. And then the property restrictions and the tax-paying restrictions went away in the first half of the 19th century. And then after the Civil War, the racial restrictions went away with the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, saying that you could not deny or abridge the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And then we in this general history, the story is that gender qualifications disappear in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, which says that you cannot discriminate based on sex. And then again, in this schematic history, I tend to refer to it sometimes as the Congressional Quarterly history of suffrage. And then race restrictions went away again in the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and other measures. That was always a little awkward for this celebratory history, because it's why racial restrictions had to go away a second time tacitly implied that they had been restored after they were banned the first time. But we didn't really dwell on that. The history, in fact, is much more complex than this notion of linear progress might suggest. To begin with, and this is just an important fact that may help you understand what is going on this week and next week. To begin with, voting rights in the United States are largely a matter of state law. There is no mention of the right to vote in the Constitution until we get to the 14th and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. And the Constitution does not have any place in it, and this may surprise you. It does not have a clause that says, and every American citizen or every American citizen age 21 or over has the right to participate in all elections. It's just not there. It wasn't there in the 18th century. It's still not there. Your right has only indirect constitutional protections. Election matters having to do with elections and voting rights were left to the states when the Constitution was written at the end of the 18th century. And with some exceptions having to do with the constitutional amendments, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, some other acts. First, to some extent, that remains the case. To a considerable extent, that remains the case. And that may explain why, or that does explain why, those of you, if there are political junkies among you who have been following the news in recent days about all the different lawsuits happening in different states, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, in different places about when absentee ballots can be turned in or when they can't or what the rules are. This is all state law because of the way the Constitution was structured. Second point I want to make about this is that the history of the right to vote is a story of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And sometimes it's a story of 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. But it was advances in suffrage, the right to vote becoming more inclusive, was always embattled. It was always a matter of struggle and organization. There were always periods of expansion followed by periods of contraction. If you think about, for example, Carrier alluded before to to women's suffrage. That was that the movement for women's suffrage was one of the largest political and social movements in the history of the country. It went on for at least 70 years and involved millions of people. Um, the for On race, the movements were not quite as numerous, but they went on again and again over a long period of time. Um, I think one way, as I'm sort of reflecting back on the histories I've written about this, one way to think about why you have this two steps forward, one step back dynamic, and yet why things do generally improve over time. That has been the overarching pattern, is that American elections have become more exclusive. Now, that might not be true, more inclusive, I'm sorry, not more exclusive. Um, that's not true in the last 20 years, but that is true over a period of 220 years. Um, and I think that one way to think of these patterns of the history um, is that ours is a history in which the ideal of democratic inclusion has grown more popular and more accepted over the years, over time. I think that if you polled people in 1820 and said, how broad should the right to vote be, you would get a different answer than you would get if you did it this year, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, even. But that coexists, that arc, that shift in belief and ideology coexists and clashes with a discomfort with a society that has often changed very rapidly. The ideal is one thing, but we have a society that has grown through immigration, large scale immigration, among other factors. But the changes in society have admitted into the polity, have admitted to the right to vote, um, people that older and more traditional citizens consider to be unworthy or undesirable. And that has happened in a recurrent pattern uh, in the history of the United States. And it has produced two long swings or contractions in our history, and they have somewhat similar origins. And I want to make comments about this, because one of these long swings is the period that we are living through right now. The uh, the first period occurs in the late 19th century, and again, some of you may know this, some of you may not, but right property restrictions on voting, tax paying restrictions are pretty much abolished by the time of the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, racial restrictions are abolished by the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But, and what that does is that enfranchises and gives political power to Black people in the South. Um, and during Reconstruction, the period just after the Civil War, Black voters elect a lot of their own candidates. They elect members of Congress, they elect senators. Um, but there is a reaction against that in the South at the end of the 19th century, and African Americans are removed wholesale from the polity. They are disenfranchised once again, through a variety of devices, grandfather clauses, tax paying requirements, literacy rules. Eventually, a decision that primaries in the Democratic Party can only include white people. And by the way, there was no Republican Party in the South in this period. So what happened in the Democratic Party was what happened. What was less draconian than the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South, but was perhaps just as important, was the passage in the same period, this is the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, of laws aimed at immigrant workers. Uh, this was voter suppression, not wholesale disenfranchisement, but it restricted the number of people who could vote. There were literacy requirements passed here in Massachusetts. The first grandfather clauses, laws which basically clauses which made it easier to vote if your grandfather had voted, were passed in Massachusetts and Connecticut, not in the South. Um, there were English language literacy tests that were passed, and frequent, registering to vote was very difficult. It was aimed at. I mean, again, I can't see the students here, but I'm guessing that a fair number of these people come from, a fair number of you come from families that were at one point immigrants to this area. Recently or further back, and these laws were targeted to keep your ancestors from voting. I bring up this late 19th century and early 20th century phenomenon, this contraction of the right to vote, in good part because it bears a direct parallel to the current world. We are now in the second period when the right to vote is very embattled, when there are tendencies in many states, not all, but many, tendencies to make voting more difficult for people, to create obstacles to voting, to engage in what is now widely called voter suppression through photo requirements that you have to present an up-to-date government-issued photo ID, the closing of polling places, the purging of voter rolls, or even most recently, some decisions about the time you have to count absentee ballots. Now, the historians' question about what's going on today, I mean, I try to train my students to ask this question, is to say, why is this happening now? Why is something happening when it happens? And I think the answer to why this is happening now resides in the fact that we live in a period now, as was true 100 years ago, which was preceded by a period of Black empowerment, which happened in the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act and a variety of other measures that gave African Americans political power, which they began to wield. And we live in a period of very large scale immigration until very, very recently. So that we have, in effect, significant influxes of new people, so to speak, into political life. And once again, I think that parts of our society are responding with an unfortunate willingness to suspend democratic principles in order to remain in power. The takeaway from this long story about the history of the right to vote, and this is a very short abridgment of this very long story, but the takeaway from this that I would urge upon you is to think of democracy as a project. Don't think of democracy as an end state. It's not, it is not a set of rules and institutions that you put into place and it's there forever. It's just not the way things work in this country or in any other one. There's always resistance to democratic forces. Democracy is an ongoing project. It's a project that needs to be nourished and protected. And just as, nourished and protected in precisely the ways, among others, that Kerry was suggesting that he had urged upon you last spring about the things to do, ways to get involved. And I think all of us, no matter how involved we decide to get, have to participate in that project of nourishing and protecting the project of democracy. Now let me turn for my final few minutes to the Electoral College, the institution that is shaping our current presidential election, much as it has shaped elections in the past. But actually, this This election has something of a peculiarity about it. As we are now in the final week of what seems like an electoral campaign that has gone on for at least a dozen years. Um, but the outcome of there will be no drama about this election were it not for the Electoral College. Right? There is no one, as far as I know, perhaps outside of the Trump family and perhaps even within the Trump family, that believes that President Trump will win the popular vote nationally next week. The pollsters have him down by 10 to 12 points, 14%. He will not win the popular vote, just as he did not win the popular vote in 2016. But the election remains in doubt, and there is suspense because of the Electoral College. So there are a couple of questions about this institution. I'm sure you folks will have many more questions, and I'm glad we will have time to do a Q&A, which is, why do we have the Electoral College? I mean, that's the question that shaped my book. I mean, the question as to why do we still have it? But let me take we have this very weird way of electing presidents. And by the way, it is not imitated anywhere else in the world. It's not imitated by any states in the U.S. in terms of how to choose their governors. It's unique. So let me break this down into two different questions. The first question is, why did we get the Electoral College in the first place? Where did it come from? Who came up with this screwball idea? It's a story, I think, about the difficulty of doing something new, and meeting, a challenge. When the framers of the Constitution gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they did not have a clear idea about how you should choose a chief executive. They thought there should be a chief executive, which there had not been under the Articles of Confederation, which governed the colonies for the decade or so before this. But they didn't know how the chief executive should be chosen. In their experience, and again, we all resort to our own experience to try to figure that. Chief executives, chief magistrates, as they were called, were either kings or appointed by kings, and they knew they didn't want either of those. So when they met in Philadelphia, and they went around and around trying to decide, many people arrived in Philadelphia thinking that actually Congress should choose the president. That was sort of the default notion for a while. But then people said, look, if you want separation of powers, you can't have Congress choosing the president. It just won't work. It'll be corrupt, and people agree with that. They talked about having a national popular vote, and there was some support for that, but not enough. And at the end of the summer, and I think we can all appreciate this. At the end of the summer, they still hadn't decided. It's Philadelphia, late August. It's hot and unpleasant. So the convention, most members of the convention went on vacation, and they left everything in the hands of a committee called the Committee on Postponed Parts. And the Committee on Postponed Parts came up with the idea of the Electoral College. And what they created, in effect, was a very complicated institution that embodied a lot of moving parts and a lot of compromises. And in the Q&A, we can talk about what some of those are, but there are compromises between slave states and free states. There are compromises between the large states and small states. There's compromises between federal national power and state power. And some of these things are not very visible. Let me mention one that's not very visible, but which could become quite visible next week. The Constitution, the Constitution specifies how many electoral votes each state gets. And that's determined by the Constitution. It's equivalent to the number of members of Congress that the state has. But then it leaves the next step very open to the states themselves. It says that electors will be chosen in such manner as the legislatures of each state shall decide. Now, what that formal language means is that there is no right to vote for president in the US Constitution. The US Constitution does not require a popular election. A state legislature can decide to choose electors by itself. You don't have a right to vote for president until the state legislature says there's going to be an election. Unless you think that this is some wild fantasy of, you know, a Harvard professor who has spent too much time in the archives. In the early 19th century, state legislatures chose electors by themselves a lot. They did it very often. South Carolina continued to do it until 1858. In New York State, there was no there was no popular election for president until 1828. And moving into more recent history, at least for those of us of a certain age, the 2000 election, which you students do not remember, I can do the demographic calculation on that, but the 2000 election, which was the disputed election, the very close election between Al Gore and George Bush, in that election, which ended up going to the courts and ended up being decided in favor of Governor and then President Bush, if the court cases had gone a different way, the Florida legislature was going to choose electors by itself to guarantee that Governor Bush would become president. It was already starting to do so. So I dwell on this because I think it's not out of the question that we're going to see something like that in the next couple of weeks if the election is quite close. Again, it's a little piece of the Constitution about the Electoral College, but what it really says is that there's no mandate to have a popular election. It's up to the state legislatures. There are other features of the Electoral College that are also very unpopular, and we can talk about the question and answer. The Electoral College was never popular. It was widely criticized from the outset. Criticism is not a 21st century phenomenon. Really beginning in 1800 or the late 1790s, there was serious efforts to change it, to modify it. There have been nearly 1,000 constitutional amendments introduced in Congress to seriously reform or abolish the Electoral College, more than on any other subject. 4 times in the early 19th century, a constitutional amendment was passed by the Senate. It came close in the House, but didn't quite get there. And in the 20th century, one branch of Congress passed constitutional amendment resolutions twice. Most recently, and let me just mention this episode, in 1969-70. In 1969, the House of Representatives approved the constitutional amendment to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote. And it was defeated very, very narrowly in the Senate. Actually, it wasn't ever defeated. There was a filibuster, which the Senate rules is people can continue debate and not agree to stop debate and actually vote. There was a filibuster that stopped it in the Senate in 1970. So why has this unpopular institution endured? Which is another version of the question of why do we still have the Electoral College? Is it you have this institution that works badly, been widely criticized. There are a number of reasons, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me mention several of them to you. One is that the Constitution is hard to amend. The U.S. Constitution requires a 2/3 vote in each branch of Congress and a 3/4 vote by the state legislatures. 3/4 of state legislatures have to approve it, and that's a very, very high bar. That's why there have been so few amendments to the US Constitution. A second ironic factor about the difficulty in changing the system is that it's so complicated and has so many flawed parts that it's been difficult to do piecemeal reform and change one thing without changing other pieces of it. For example, since about the 1820s or the 18 teens, there's been widespread sentiment that um, that there's no reason to have actual human electors casting votes. They can just cause problems, and they're not serving any deliberative function as they were once imagined to do, and they're just messengers. So why not have them? Why not just have it done by piece of paper? But there's and everybody agreed with that, but it was politically impossible to pass a constitutional amendment that only dealt with that feature of the Electoral College and didn't deal with any other features. A third factor has to do with partisan interests. When political parties decide that the Electoral College is in their party's interest, it will help them win elections. They block reform. This does not happen all the time. This is not a constant in US history. There have been a lot of bipartisan efforts to alter things, but it has been a characteristic of the period that you and I live in. The period from 1980 to the present, and particularly since 2000 to the present, has been a period when the Republican Party is convinced, almost the entire party, is convinced that the Electoral College serves its interests, makes it easier for it to win elections, and thus they oppose any kind of reform. The last factor that I want to mention, and it's very important, is race, and the history of the South in the United States. I can go into the detail. Let me state this succinctly, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it. The Electoral College, in its structure, gave advantages to white Southerners or to the white South. Southern states during the period of slavery were able to cast electoral votes on behalf of slaves who could not vote. And after slavery, after African Americans were disenfranchised again at the end of the 19th century, Southern states had the advantage of what amounted to a, quote, 5/5 clause. African Americans counted fully for representation in Congress and thus for electoral votes, but they could not vote again. They once again could not vote. As a consequence of this dynamic, white Southerners ferociously opposed any attempt to switch to a national popular vote. And, as a result of these obstacles and others, we retain an institution in this country, the Electoral College, that, again, has never been imitated elsewhere, that most people in the United States do not understand. When they're occasionally given these civics questions, these surveys out there, most people do not know how the institution works. But we do know that the Electoral College contravenes the basic tenets of democracy that we believe in. One person, one vote is, to my mind, a very fundamental democratic principle. And the Electoral College, because it does not adhere to that principle, also permits the person who loses the popular election to become president, something that I don't think we allow in any other election. So what I've written in this book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, is a history of trying to understand why reform has been so difficult to achieve. But despite having written that it's a history of defeat, I'm not a pessimist about the possibilities of change. I mean, I don't think it's going to be easy. I don't think I can snap my fingers after this election and say, aha, okay, now it's time to do away with the Electoral College. But as a historian, one of the things as a historian I learned is that things can and do change. And I think that there is a broader and stronger pro-democracy movement in the United States um, now than there has been at any time since the 1960s. And it is particularly strong among the young, among you folks and your older brothers and sisters. Um, I think that this impulse, it's a broad impulse, and it's calling for numerous reforms to make it easier to vote, um, to remove barriers to voting, to put an end to gerrymandering so that it's not a fair or equal competition in many electoral districts, and to put an end to the Electoral College. Um, and I think that this movement is gathering steam. It's not a single movement. It's not a single organization, but I think it's a spirit as much as a movement. And I think I want to close these comments by urging you to participate in that movement. Um, not in a partisan fashion, not for one party or another, or a third or a fourth. There's no necessary reason to just have two parties, but to participate in that democratizing movement um, as citizens who, at some moments at least, we know from the history, not at all moments, but at some moments, can wield enough power collectively. You only wield power if you do it together. Can wield enough power collectively to carry the project of democracy forward as others have carried it forward in the past. Thank you. I'm sorry for having taken a little bit more time than we had originally envisioned, but I'm looking forward to your questions.
Dr. Keyssar, thank you so much for all that history, that important history, and how it relates to where we are today. I have a couple of questions that have come in, and anybody else that has questions, just submit them through the Q&A here. We have a lot of questions coming in. All right, so the first one here is, if the president loses the popular, there's a statement and a question. If the president loses the popular vote, he or she does not represent the people, period. With gerrymandering and the Electoral College, would you even consider this a democracy?
Well, that's that's both a pretty direct and a pretty sophisticated question. Look, to be candid, I would say that with gerrymandering, and if you have an electoral college result like that, um, it would be difficult to proclaim that the U.S. really was a democracy or matched democratic principles. And I will go one step further with the question: if you toss the Senate into the mix, where two senators for each state is not very proportional to population. So I would say that, I mean, how to phrase this? I would say that our democratic credentials as a country are seriously tarnished by the Electoral College and by gerrymandering.
Next question here. How often do faithless electors influence an election? Is it possible that they could play a role in this upcoming election?
Faithless electors have never determined the outcome of an election. That's probably a good thing. There have been, I forget the number, I used to know it, 55, 60 faithless electors over time. There were a handful in the last election in 2016. I think that we're going to see fewer now and in the future because it's a complicated legal maneuver. But the Supreme Court last June issued a verdict saying that it is legal for states to have laws that will, in effect, prohibit faithless electors from voting for the person they prefer and not the person they're pledged to. So the Supreme Court, to my surprise, and the surprise of some of my friends, said that those state laws were okay. About somewhat more than half the states have them. and I suspect that others will adopt them. So I think that that will disappear.
I should have asked this question first, but could you just in a sentence, Dr. Keyssar, explain exactly what a faithless elector is?
Of course, a faithless elector is an elector who casts their actual electoral vote for someone other than the candidate that they were pledged to vote for when they became an elector, or that they committed themselves to voting for. The electors in the modern world, the world that we live in today, electors are chosen by the political parties, and they are generally party loyalists, and they are expected to to vote with the party where that they go to ask to be an elector. It actually a personal story. It actually occurred to me this summer that, having just published this book on called "Why Do We Have the Electoral College," that it might be interesting for me to become an elector. And I got in touch with the Democratic Party, which was certainly going to win in Massachusetts. And it turned, and I thought this was such an ingenious idea. I wrote this book, "Let Me Be an Elector, Let Me See How It Works." I was one day past the deadline for applying to be an elector. It was sometime early in August. So anyway.
The next question here is, do you think that ranked choice voting could help the American election process? And if so, how?
I have to say, I'm really impressed by these questions, guys. I mean, I in preparing this talk and even in giving it, I didn't quite know how to pitch it because, in fact, most of the students that I teach are graduate students or advanced graduate students who are 10 years older than you are. But you guys are asking great questions and informed questions. Ranked choice voting, does everyone know what ranked choice voting is? It's on the ballot in Massachusetts next week. Ranked choice voting is a system where you don't just vote for one candidate if there are multiple candidates. You rank your preference order. This is my first choice. This is my second choice, etc. I think ranked choice voting is going to become more and more common. I think it will win in Massachusetts on Tuesday, and I think that ranked choice voting solves a bunch of problems. It often without ranked choice voting in important elections, the cliche is that you're left, if you don't like the candidates of the two major parties, you're left with a choice of, do you vote for the lesser of two evils, the candidate you dislike least, or do you vote for a fringe party or a third party, a fourth party, and risk wasting your vote, so to speak? And ranked choice voting solves that problem. It doesn't force you to choose. You can vote for the person that you really agree with, and then if that person isn't really in contention, your second place vote could be for the lesser of two evils. So I think that there are a lot of interesting organizations and people getting behind ranked choice voting. Some of them, and I'm not sure I completely agree with this, but some of them because I think it will lead to less extreme partisan politics in both parties. Because, for example, one example that is pointed to, for example, is the Republican primaries in 2016, that if there had been ranked choice voting among that array of candidates, that Donald Trump would never have been the candidate of the Republican Party.
I'm going to link two questions here because there may be overlap in your response. One, do you think that there would be any negative effects of getting rid of the Electoral College? Perhaps linked, do you believe that the popular vote would further disenfranchise voters living in rural areas that are less densely populated, including agricultural workers, et cetera? And if so, sort of what feasible alternatives are to responding to that problem?
And what was the first question was, are there disadvantages to moving to a national?
Yes, what would the negative effects potentially be?
Let me deal with the second question first. and again, these are very good questions. These are issues that have come that come up in the public debates. I don't think that the switching to a national popular vote would significantly disadvantage people who live in rural areas. Um, I think that for one thing, people who there's a tendency in these debates to equate rural areas and small states, and that's actually not. It's not a fair equation. Um, the largest agricultural state in the United States is California. Um, and there's a lot of agriculture in upstate New York too. But smaller states and those that are predominantly rural, but if they're small, would lose a slight edge that they have now in the number of electoral votes that they get, because every state gets two for its two senators. But the fact is that candidates are not paying attention to the small states now anyway. The only way a small state gets any attention is if it's a swing state. The only small state right now getting attention from the national campaign is New Hampshire, because it's not certain which way it will go. So I don't think that there will be a loss there. Might there be disadvantages or downsides of a national popular vote? Yes. I say that even though I support it, we will have to, we being the United States, will have to create some modern, efficient mechanism for administering elections in the United States. We can't have a national popular vote and still have elections administered by 50 different states, with 18 counties in each one. That's not what we have now. Our presidential election is not a national election. It's an assembly of 50 state elections, and with different rules, et cetera. That will have to be completely modernized and streamlined and integrated. And will there be problems with that? Certainly. Will there be inefficiencies with that? Certainly. Are there chances that there could be different forms of fraud and corruption with a national vote? Yes. I don't think there'll be necessarily more fraud or corruption. There's very little fraud now. But I think that the forms might be different. And I also think, and I say this, someone who has studied reform and engaged in reform movements, that anyone who's advocating a significant shift like this has to recognize that there will be unforeseen consequences of reform. Campaigning will change. So in some ways we can predict how campaigning will change. And the people who fear that the campaigns will just be conducted in large metropolitan areas. I'm not sure that that's true. In some places, the scope of campaigning might be broadened, but it will change, and it will change in some ways that we don't foresee.
Next question here is if the voting age is not something mandated by the Constitution, where does that rule come from?
The voting age is mandated by the Constitution, or its structural outlines are mandated by the Constitution. It comes from. It comes from. Actually, this is an interesting point. I think it's the case, and I have to say, take this answer with a grain of salt. I may not be right about this, but I think that this is largely, in fact, the question is right. This is largely a matter of state law that does not come from the Constitution. Where the Constitution comes in is in an amendment to the Constitution. I forget which number it is, 26, perhaps 25, 26, 27. That's passed around 1970, around 1969 or 70, that says that a state cannot have an age requirement that restricts the ability to vote of anybody 18 or over. So that so basically it says you can't, Massachusetts cannot have a voting age of 21. It can go lower than 18, but it can't. It can't go above 21. I think that's where the only place where the Constitution comes in. Just as a brief story on that, that was the constitutional amendment that was passed in the shortest amount of time ever, because Congress had had passed a voting age is 18 law, which was challenged in the courts, and the courts said that Congress had the power to pass an age law for federal elections, but not for state elections. So that there was, at that point, once the court had decided that the voting age was 18 in federal elections and 21 in most state elections, which created an administrative nightmare for the officials who had to administer an election that fall. So they rapidly got a constitutional amendment passed in about 6 weeks.
To your earlier point, Dr. Keyssar, how in fact are electoral college representatives selected? What's the criteria for the process?
The criteria are in the modern world is basically service to the party and known loyalty. There is a constitutional restriction. You cannot be a federal office holder, right? You can't be a member of Congress and be an elector. You can't even hold or kind of any sort of high federal position in the bureaucracy. There was in one of our disputed elections in the past, one of the disputes was over whether a postmaster could serve as an elector, because he held a high federal office. But basically now this is just party organization, party rewards, no particular qualifications.
My next question is, would you say that the US can learn from the democracies or government systems of other countries? And if so, which countries would those be?
I certainly think that we can learn from other countries. I mean, I think all countries can learn from other countries. I would say, I guess I would point to, I think that we should be taking a good hard look at countries that use proportional representation to choose its Congress or its legislature, rather than our system. Our system, political scientists refer to it as single member district, first past the post. What does that jargon mean? It means the system that we have that we're all familiar with, which is that if you run for Congress, it's the person who gets the most votes, not necessarily a majority. So it's the first past, and members of Congress are chosen for individual congressional districts. That's not the only way to organize a legislature. There are proportional systems where you might have, say, a party that runs in Massachusetts that says, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and they compete for a percentage of the vote. And if they get 30% of the vote in Massachusetts, they get 30% of the seats. That's one place that we can learn. I think a second area that we can learn from, it's a truly startling example, is Australia with compulsory voting. Turnout in the United States, as you people know, is not very high. I mean, there's talk that it's going to be high this year, and I expect that will be the case. But high is going to mean that close to 60%, maybe 62% of the eligible electorate is going to vote in this election. What that means, just put this in context, that means that more people will not vote than will vote for either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. To my mind, that's a disturbing statistic. Australia had a problem like this in the 19-teens and the early 1920s, where turnout was low. They passed a law making showing up to vote compulsory. I mean, you could have some laws that some exceptions that were made. Voting was made compulsory. That was passed in about 1923, 1924. And 96% of the country's been voting in every election ever since. And it's become just an accepted thing that everybody votes. I think we could take a serious look at that.
All right, we're going to go with one more question here. And the question is this: in a hypothetical scenario in which DC and Puerto Rico gain statehood, should there be a Missouri Compromise style agreement in order to balance red and blue states? And to what extent should we work within a two-party system?
Oh yeah, those are simple questions. On the Missouri Compromise in DC and Puerto Rico, the Missouri Compromise, and this would be true of anything that would have to do with new states. I mean, there's nothing principled about it. This is a matter of hardball politics and which parties are going to benefit, and that will be the case again. As I'm sure the questioner knows, DC statehood has come up before, and the opposition to it really is that they don't want two more Democratic senators and two more Black Democratic senators to be even more candidate. And then the part about this two-party system. Wait, can you rephrase that for me again, Erin?
Sure. The second question was, to what extent should we work within a two-party system in America?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. There are some advantages to a two-party system. There are really serious disadvantages too. I think that I think that's a judgment that's made over time, and not a judgment you make once and for all. First, you want to figure out what your political values and ideals are, and to see whether they fit most with one of the two major parties, or might fit with some other organization, in which case you would want to work outside it. And then I think the question of whether, a small party or a small organization outside of parties, which you're hoping to build and make larger, whether it forms coalitions with one of the dominant parties, becomes a pragmatic one that you deal with over time. I myself I'm not a great fan of a two-party system. I think, various people have commented that having two parties gives you only one more choice than having one party. And I would like to see a party system that made it easier to inject new ideas into policy discussion. But so far, I haven't convinced the rest of the country to go along with me on that.
Dr. Keyssar, thank you so much. This is such a good way to start the day for all of us.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm going to let Mr. Brennan sort of send us off here. I would just remind everyone that we're going to reconvene at 10 a.m. for the next session. And that's all I'll say. So, Mr.
Okay, well, let me thank the two of you for introducing me, and to all the students out there, let me thank you for coming and for really asking such pointed and informed questions. I'm impressed.
Professor Keyssar, thanks so much for your smart and provocative presentation, and the way in which you responded to the questions, which I think made for a very interesting kickoff to our day today. You did not disappoint, I assure you. I can't imagine anybody who's more knowledgeable about these matters than you, and you're great to be with us today. So thank you again. And now, boys, if in the spirit of this day and the liturgy that we typically have, before you sing the Founder's Song in your own homes, which I hope will be a lusty rendition, could we just lift up our hearts for a moment? O God, beneath thy guiding hand, our exiled forebears crossed the sea. And when they trod the wintry strand, with prayer and psalm they worshiped thee. Make us similarly humble, similarly grateful, as today we stand before you and in awe of our founder, the Apostle Eliot. While John Eliot's visionary work was critical in the foundation of this ancient grammar school, throughout the generations, it has been the ongoing stewardship of our trustees, dedication of hundreds of committed masters, and the dynamism of thousands of full-hearted boys that has breathed life into Eliot's dream. Keep us mindful that we stand on the shoulders of the great, as we endeavor to do your work every day in this place and beyond. Keep us grateful too for the unique rights and responsibilities we enjoy as citizens of this Commonwealth and country, and inspire us in the tradition of our founder to lead and serve. And now, given your families that have surely gathered with you in order to watch this opening gambit of our Founders Day presentation, please pass the peace, of course, at a social distance. Thanks very much. See you at 10 o'clock.